Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 35. Glencairn's Falling. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome the new members of the House of Lords, the Earl of Aberystwyth, Tom Devlin, and Aaron, Baron O'Brien. If you want to join their ranks and listen to the podcast ad-free, go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica. Last time, Glencairn's Rising got off the ground. The English occupation of Scotland, led by Robert Lilburne, soon realised that the fragmented violence that smouldered across the Highlands wasn't fragmented after all. By the end of 1653, a Royalist rebellion had grown in strength to the point where English patrols were being picked off all across the country, and they were even making raids into northern England. Like all early modern numbers, and especially an insurgency like the Rising, we can't be certain about the size of the Royalist force, and a large part of that is because the people at the time didn't really know. By the end of 1653, Lilburne had been informed by a rescued English prisoner that the Royalists had a force of more than 8,000 men. The commander dismissed this as simply too high, and instead the government estimated that Glencairn had no more than 4,000 to 5,000 men. Not an insignificant force by any means, and no one who had faced a Highland charge could underestimate them, but far less than the Commonwealth army could bring to bear. These estimates were shaken somewhat when a letter was intercepted. In this correspondence, the Rising's leaders claimed that by March they would command a force of 20,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Worse, they expected that the king would soon arrive at the head of a Dutch army of 13,000 men. Now this was all nonsense. There was no way that the Royalists could expect that much recruitment, and any promises of foreign aid, as we'll cover shortly, could simply not be counted on. But as 1653 turned to 1654, the Rising did continue to grow. They were able to raid into Moray and Nairn, and gathering supplies and recruits won more support from Scottish lords. As we saw last time, many Scottish nobles were hedging their bets, unwilling to throw their full weight behind a rebellion which might easily be snuffed out by the powerful English army and leave them to the mercy of the Commonwealth sequestrations. But the successes of 1653 and the ever-present worry that their estates were already on the chopping block because of the vagueness of English policy, meant that more and more were won over to the cause of the Stuarts. Major figures and landowners like the Earl of Mar, the Earl of Selkirk, Lord Charles Gordon, and the Marquis of Montrose all joined the cause in this period, bringing their resources and reputation to Glencairn. Of course, that Marquis of Montrose is not James Graham, Marquis of Montrose, who was hanged in 1650. This was his son, also called James. Young James Graham had arrived in London after the regicide, and won enough support from the Republican government and Cromwell himself that when he returned to Scotland, his father's estates and title were restored to him, making him the second Marquis of Montrose. He then, a tad ungratefully, joined the rebellion to pull down the Republican regime. Another significant name to note is Lord Lorne. Lorne was none other than the Marquis of Argyll's son and heir. He defected from the Commonwealth and his father in July 1653. Apparently, after a heated argument with his father, Lorne had taken a horse and ridden straight to a meeting of Royalists near Glenorchy. This was obviously very embarrassing for Argyll himself, and he wrote an angry letter to his son, essentially telling him that he should fear God and respect his parents, and otherwise he would go to hell. Other senior members of Clan Campbell wrote to the heir, urging him to repent and come back into the fold. Argyll wrote to his kinsman, John Campbell, a few weeks later, which included the following passage, quote, "As for what you say anent my son, though I know nothing of the particular, yet I can believe your information, for I trust nothing to him, but that he will run to every excess of riot with the wildest that are his associates. And as I told you before, I do still advise you not to suffer him, nor any of his complices, to enter in any of your houses, and I discharge you of any prejudice by me, though you kill him in keeping him out by force." End quote. These all indicate the strength of Argyll's anger and hurt at his son for betraying him, but in context we can be less sure of that. These letters may have been addressed to Lorne or to John Campbell, but they were meant for Lilburne. Argyll even included a copy of his first letter when he wrote to Lilburne to inform him of his son's defection. Look how angry I am at him for rebelling. His letter to John wasn't sent directly to Lilburne, but Argyll knew full well how often his letters were intercepted and read by the English. More than one historian has suggested that Lorne's defection and his falling out with Argyll, while probably genuine, was also probably hammed up for the benefit of the English. If so, it was a clever bit of double-dealing. Whether or not Glencairn's rising was successful, the Argyll family would stay in the good graces of the winner. Argyll himself probably believed he benefited more from an English victory, but if the rebellion succeeded, he would have his son by the restored king's side. The defection of Lord Lorne was a double-edged sword for the Royalists. He should have been a catch. As the heir of Argyll, he could call on the allegiance and kinship of people all across the Highlands. But when Lorne put his name to a letter to the exiled king, denouncing Glencairn's leadership, the chief of Clan Cunningham took immediate action. He ordered Glengarry to find Lorne and arrest him. This was perhaps an overreaction, and it was certainly a mistake. There was almost a fight between forces loyal to the two nobles, which was narrowly avoided, although both men now absolutely hated each other. What made their feud, and Lorne's dislike of Glencairn burn hotter, was of course Scottish dynastic politics. Glencairn was a cousin of the executed Duke of Hamilton, and so he held a grudge against Argyll and the Campbells for basically everything over the last 15 years. Lorne resented him right back for his ties to the Hamiltons and for being a lowlander. Worse, Glengarry, who Glencairn had sent to arrest the Campbell heir, was a MacDonald, the ancestral rivals of the Campbells. Dow struggles to explain what he calls, quote, the extraordinary tactlessness of sending a MacDonald to arrest a Campbell, end quote. The split within the Royalist ranks only deepened in the winter. Due to debts owed by the Huntleys to the Campbells, Lord Lorne asserted his right to command troops raised from Huntly territory. Glencairn dismissed this claim outright, which offended Lorne so much he tried to defect. After trying, and failing, to betray Glencairn to the English garrison, Lorne was brought back into the fold. The bridge was publicly mended, but Lorne still led most of the Campbells away from the main Royalist force, refusing to serve under Glencairn. In January and February 1654, the rising suffered some setbacks. The defeats of December were repeated and English commanders routed Glencairn's forces in the northeast. Aberdeenshire had been garrisoned by the Royalists, but they had quickly been kicked out by the government. In Perthshire, the English Colonel Daniel had captured more than 100 Royalist soldiers, which opened the door to yet another squabble among the Royalist leadership, as Glencairn's authority was questioned once again. With the Royalist leadership in disarray, Lilburne continued to try and win the Scottish people over. When the army seized horses, he ordered that their owners be given a receipt of their value, and allowances were made for landowners to keep a few for their personal use. He forbade the soldiers from poaching rabbits or birds or taking fruit and vegetables from orchards and gardens. Garrisons were ordered to stop extorting money from civilians. For God's sake, we're trying to win hearts and minds here. And commissions of inquiry were set up to examine the conduct of soldiers in Aberdeenshire. When soldiers were quartered in civilian homes, Lilburne attempted to pay the householders for the burden. He begged London to send more money for this purpose. As we covered last time, Lilburne was wise to the impact which financial hardship was having. He wanted to compromise with Scottish lairds and the nobility to bring them into the fold and cut off the rising at its roots. A conference of shire representatives met in Edinburgh to evaluate the finances of their communities and allow them a say in how much tax was levied on them. The result of the conference was a 25% reduction in the cess for each shire. This was a very good move. For starters, the Scots were consulted in their own taxation, which always goes down well. Getting local notables involved in the system made the system itself more efficient. They knew how their communities worked far better than any outsider. It made the English look magnanimous and won them support from the taxpayers. It also acknowledged, without acknowledging, the truth that the original cess amount wasn't being collected anyway, and it was only becoming more difficult as the rebellion spread and the cess fell into Royalist coffers. The reduction in the cess was a masterstroke for Lilburne, which made it all the more jarring when the nominated assembly in London demanded that the full cess be collected anyway. Lilburne, probably after he was done screaming in frustration, wrote a letter urging them to reconsider and explaining why it was a terrible idea. He never got official approval for reducing the cess, but it also never increased. As we also touched on last time, Lilburne offered reductions in the cess as encouragement for Royalists to switch sides, or moderates to stay loyal. He also suggested that the estates of major Royalists, Glencairn, Atholl and so on, could be distributed as compensation to those landowners who suffered for their loyalty to the state. Lilburne also tried to make the courts more lenient towards Loyalists, and he personally intervened in the prosecutions for debt of numerous important nobles who he was hoping to keep on side. The new Marquis of Huntly, for example, the Earl of Mar, the Earl of Lothian, and so forth. He also pushed for creditors to accept payment in forms other than cash, land and goods in particular, because Scotland was not a cash-rich economy. Some of this advice was finally taken up by the new Protectorate Council of State, which passed ordinances along these lines in April and May 1654, but by then Lilburne was gone. In January 1654, Lilburne received the news he'd been hoping for. George Monck had been appointed as the new Commander-in-Chief in Scotland. For the next few months, Lilburne prepared for his departure, as the Anglo-Dutch War wound down, but it would take until April for Monck to arrive and give Lilburne the break he was so desperate for. There was also a change in leadership among the Royalists. At the end of February, news had arrived which electrified the Royalist cause and worried the English. General John Middleton, the King's chosen commander in Scotland, had finally arrived. More than a year and a half after he had first been appointed by the exiled Charles, Middleton arrived at Tarbet Ness at the end of February 1654. He arrived alongside Sir George Monro, who we've seen before. He was the nephew of Robert Monro, the famous and talented Scottish commander who had served alongside Gustavus Adolphus and Alexander Leslie, and who was currently sitting in the Tower of London, although he'd soon be released to a quiet retirement in Ireland. George had taken over his uncle's position in Northern Ireland before serving with the Engagers and then escaping to exile. But the main feeling at Middleton's arrival wasn't happiness or relief, but disappointment, on both sides, from local and exiled Royalists, because both sides had talked their positions up far beyond reality. The locals were disappointed immediately because some of the wilder rumours had said that Charles was coming too, so his absence was noticed straight away. But Middleton arrived with about 80 men, 300 barrels of gunpowder, and 5,000 muskets. The supplies were welcome, but local Royalists had been promised, repeatedly, a massive number of reinforcements. 80 guys would just not cut it. The exiles were also disappointed because everything the locals had reported had exaggerated their successes. Middleton arrived to find that the Royalists were far less dominant than he had expected. He had hoped to swan in and take command of a rebellion on the cusp of victory, and despite Glencairn's wins, the rising was still very far from that. Both sides, local and exile, had good reason for garnishing the truth. The exiles had constantly told the locals that help was just over the horizon, that reinforcements would help crush the English, that the Dutch would clear the way, and that the restoration of the Stuarts was a certainty. None of that was true, but they needed the locals to keep fighting an unequal fight, and they might not have if they'd realised how tenuous their situation really was. But don't feel too bad for the locals, because they fibbed just as much. Once the rising was underway, the rebel leaders needed the exiles to send them reinforcements, supplies, and political support. The local leadership knew full well that they were facing an uphill battle, and their only real chance of success would come from over the sea. If the exile court thought their rebellion was hopeless, they might cut them off and hang them out to dry. So both exiles and locals had good reason to tell the other what they wanted to hear. In March and April, Lilburne wrote to Lord Protector Cromwell and informed him that the rebellion was spreading and that the lowlands were increasingly at risk. At the end of March, Dumfries and Galloway erupted in rebellion. This was devastating for the occupation, not because of the rebellion itself, which was easily put down, but because it showed that even regions of Scotland which had been seen as secure and loyal could not be counted on. English estimates of Glencairn, now Middleton's forces, were quite formidable too. If the rebels made a united effort, English control of Scotland could be shattered. Fortunately for the Commonwealth, the rebels could not unite. The newly arrived George Monroe did not get on with Glencairn, and the two men actually fought a duel. Glengarry, the other major figure in the rebellion, almost came to blows with the Earl of Athol. When Middleton made Monroe his second-in-command, snubbing both Glencairn and Glengarry, who had actually been leading this thing while he'd twiddled his thumbs in exile, Glencairn was furious. He withdrew his own troops from the main force. Later on, Montrose and Lorne almost killed each other. So the Royalist coalition was many things, but unified it was not. Finally, in April, General Monck arrived in Dalkeith, and Lilburne gratefully transferred to the much less stressful position of Governor of York. Monck arrived fresh from the Dutch War, and he was in a much stronger position than his predecessor. Politically, he had a commission which made him the head of both the military and civilian government in Scotland. He was effectively dictator everywhere the Commonwealth controlled. Lilburne had always been acting commander, which limited his practical authority. Monck's reputation and his connections in London also meant his demands were not ignored like Lilburne's had often been. But outside of Monck's own positives, his position was helped immensely by events outside of his direct control. The Treaty of Westminster had just been signed as Monck arrived, ending the war with the Dutch and freeing up a lot of troops, money and attention. To be fair, Monck played a role in ending that war. The second major change had taken place at the end of 1653, the dissolution of Barebone's Parliament, and its replacement with the Protectorate. Instead of the bulky, meandering, distracted, nominated assembly, the government was now in the hands of a small executive council of state headed by Monck's personal friend, Oliver Cromwell. These factors almost immediately paid dividends. Monck had arrived at Dalkeith and found that Lilburne had been promised £50,000 to refill the treasury and pay his men, 10 ships to guard the coast, and reinforcements of infantry and cavalry. These promises had been made months ago, but London hadn't delivered. So Monck wrote to London and demanded that these promises be fulfilled, and also that he wanted extra reinforcements. He informed Cromwell that he had been surprised by the extent of the rebellion, and he emphasized how dangerous the situation was. That was why he needed more men. With the change in circumstances, and with the personal insistence of the Protector, Monck soon received most of what he demanded. He never got anywhere near as much money as he needed, and he had to fend off multiple attempts to transfer his soldiers elsewhere, but Monck started his rule in a much stronger position than Lilburne had ever been in. Lilburne's advice and recommendations hadn't disappeared into the ether, and we can clearly see the influence of his ideas on Monck's new regime. As I mentioned earlier, the Council of State enacted ordinances to give leniency to Scottish debtors, to allow flexible treatment of rebels, and an ordinance of pardon and grace, which finally made clear who amongst the Scottish political nation was going to be punished for the Second and Third Civil Wars. These had been drafted at Lilburne's insistence, but it was Monck who benefited. Monck could now offer a much nicer carrot, but he paired it with a much heavier stick. His instructions, the official remit of his power, allowed him to levy fines on anyone who helped the rebellion. Fathers, households, clan chiefs, entire communities faced collective punishment for the actions of any rebels they were responsible for. Shires were held liable for any robberies or murders which were committed in their boundaries. The instructions also permitted Monck to arrest anyone who was disobedient to the government. Monck demanded further powers, writing directly to Cromwell to request the right to imprison fathers and masters whose sons or apprentices had joined Glencairn. While still waiting to hear back from the Lord Protector, who would say yes, Monck just went ahead and announced his threat. In a public proclamation, Monck declared that rebels would have 20 days to surrender, or else their parents would be arrested. If they surrendered within those 20 days, all would be forgiven. Pardons would be granted. Monck also offered compensation for any loyal Scot whose lands or fortune were harmed by the Royalists. This would come from the estates of the rebels, another of Lilburne's recommendations. Bounties were also placed on the Royalist leadership, dead or alive. Fortunately for Scotland, Monck didn't make much use of his more tyrannical powers. He rarely followed through on imprisoning the guardians and parents of known rebels, but the important thing was that he could. He had the tools for dealing with the civilian population as he saw fit. which gave him flexibility which Lilburne had lacked. The other important development was the Union. It had been years since the Commonwealth of England declared that Scotland would be incorporated into it, but it had sat on the back burner all that time. Twice a Bill of Union had been considered by Parliament, first the Rump and then Barebones, and twice it had died with those parliaments. But in April 1654, the Protectorate Council finally issued an Ordinance of Union, granting Scotland 30 MPs in the upcoming Protectorate Parliament. The Union removed the office of the monarchy and any rights of a distinctly Scottish Parliament to meet or govern, and it discharged the people of Scotland from any allegiance to either institution. It also offered free trade between England and Scotland, fairer taxes, and the abolition of feudal responsibilities. Tenants no longer owed their landlords military service, only rent. The role of local magnates in justice was restricted to new courts baron, similar to English manor courts. But Monck had not come to Scotland just to announce a few new laws. Johnson of Warriston recorded in his diary how Dean and Lilburne had tried to pacify Scotland through fair means, but now Monck, quote, would try it with rigour and ruin. Monck spent the weeks between April and June preparing for his military campaign. His objective was to secure the lowlands. If he could stop raids out of the highlands and prevent reinforcements flowing from the lowlands, he could stop the growth of the rebellion. He stayed in Dalkeith until the 10th of May, when he marched north to Stirling. He stayed here until the 14th, then he marched east and west, securing his garrisons, before marching to Loch Lomond. Here he ordered that the Loch's boats be destroyed, to prevent them being used to aid the rebels. Back to Stirling, he then marched on Perth. By this time it was June, and Monck had been limited in what he could accomplish. His supplies were too low to properly gather his forces, but this show of force had complemented his earlier proclamations. Reports flowed to his headquarters of rebels surrendering, favouring the carrot over the stick. But there were more reports of skirmishes and fighting. Argyll was one of Monck's first correspondents upon taking up his post. He wrote to the Highland Lord, expressing his friendly greetings and his hopes that Argyll would cooperate with his campaign. After some haggling, Argyll offered his support to Monck's garrisons in his territory, closing off a substantial region of the Highlands to the rebellion. In mid-June, Monck learned that the Royalists were mustering near Loch Ness, and so the general gathered his forces and marched north. Middleton seems to have wanted to move south, but Argyll's cooperation made that a dangerous proposition. Instead, he divided his forces. His infantry marched north to Kintail and boarded ships for the Isle of Skye, and his cavalry rode to Lochaber. Middleton went with his infantry, retreating north. Monck's intelligence reported all of this to the general, and on the 1st of July he ordered Colonel Morgan into Caithness, with an order which will define Monck's campaign. He was to destroy the crops, kill the cattle, and burn the houses of Caithness. Scorched earth. The rebels would be denied supplies and shelter. As for the civilian population, that was a distant secondary concern. Fortunately for the people of Caithness, Morgan never carried out this particular order before it was changed by Monck. Unfortunately for the Camerons, the Mackenzies, and the Macdonalds, their lands throughout the central and northwest Highlands faced this fate instead. These lands had already faced years of war and pillage by both Royalist and Commonwealth troops, and now the region was devastated. Monck's hope was that Middleton would not be able to supply any sizable army, and he would be forced to disperse it or face the gauntlet of English garrisons to reach the lowlands. Monck changed his orders to Morgan when he received word that Middleton had chosen a third option. He had been sighted moving south, into Atholl with an army 4,000 strong. Morgan's new orders were to march south to Riven, as Monck himself marched on Atholl. For more than a week, Monck pursued Middleton as the Royalist commander aimed for Loch Lomond. A scouting party under Colonel Oakey bumped into a rebel force under the Earl of Atholl himself. Atholl escaped and warned Middleton that the English were much closer than anticipated. Middleton took off, heading west, and Monck continued the chase. Finally, on the 14th of July, Monck got to see Middleton's main force with his own eyes. At Glen Stray, 5 miles of rough terrain separated the two armies, so Monck couldn't engage his enemy, but his arrival forced the Royalists to scatter. Monck pursued one part of the rebel army, the part led by Middleton, northeast, towards Badenoch, which is just a few miles away from Riven, where Morgan's force was waiting. Monck and his officers clearly felt confident. They slackened their pace, to the relief of their exhausted troops, who had just force-marched across some of the roughest terrain in Britain, and they wrote home, their letters full of the belief that Middleton's days were numbered. And things looked bad for the Royalists. 5 weeks of pursuit, pillaging, skirmishes, and constant pressure had worn away Middleton's numbers. Monck reported that Middleton's infantry, which had numbered about 3,000 the previous month, had been reduced by 2/3. Discipline within the army was also fraying, and troops deserted in droves. Monck kept up the pressure, herding Middleton towards Riven and the waiting Colonel Morgan. Morgan himself had moved slightly south, towards his quarry, and on the evening of the 19th of July, his vanguard spotted the enemy. Middleton had ridden ahead with about 800 cavalry. Now, even though this had been carefully planned by the English, they seemed to have been surprised by the sudden appearance of the Royalist horse. The Royalists were just more surprised, and the terrain was against them. They'd just ridden through a narrow pass, and couldn't easily turn and go back the way they came. The Commonwealth cavalry charged at the confused rebels, and it didn't take much to rout them. The cavalry scattered. Some dismounted, leaving their horses to be captured while they fled along paths cavalry could not take. Many of these dismounted cavalrymen were actually robbed by the locals. Others kept riding, and were chased for more than 6 miles. Middleton himself escaped, though he was wounded, and he went north to Sutherland and safety. This skirmish wasn't any great affair, but it was decisive. It essentially removed the Royalist cavalry from the war. Colonel Morgan captured 300 horses, and the rest of the cavalry were either killed or scattered. The loss of the cavalry didn't end the rebellion. There was still Middleton's infantry, who were pursued by Morgan but were not scattered along with the cavalry. There were also the other Royalist leaders who hadn't been with Middleton, Lorne and Glencairn for starters, who still commanded sizable forces. But Middleton had with him most of the cavalry, and it was cavalry which threatened Commonwealth control of the lowlands. The fight was not over. Middleton had escaped, and he could recover his forces with time. Monck was not going to give him time. For the rest of July, Monck's forces chased any stragglers they could find, catching many prisoners and punching the bruise. But in August, Monck put into effect his ruthless strategy. Targeting regions known to have supported the rebels, Perthshire and Dunbartonshire in particular, Monck's forces slowly made their way through the countryside, putting everything to the torch. All crops and fields fit for horse grazing were burnt to ash. The Royalists would find no support anymore. Worse for the civilian population, as the rebels fell back, they tended to do the same, burning and pillaging the land as they withdrew. Middleton had fled to Caithness, where many communities supported the Royalist cause, and so Monck revived his earlier orders to Morgan. He was to chase the Royalist general and catch him if he could, but his priority was to burn the crops and houses of the Caithness population. He would be supported by 2 frigates of the state's navy, who patrolled between Inverness and the Pentland Firth, catching any smugglers attempting to supply the rebels. Middleton kept out of Morgan's clutches, riding west with Morgan's men on his tail. Caithnesians who surrendered and agreed to pay restitution were spared Morgan's tender mercies. By the end of August, Monck's strategy of rigour and ruin had paid dividends. Many rank-and-file rebels were surrendering, partly because they couldn't support themselves off the land now, it was ash, and partly because the English had maintained an earlier punishment for captured Scottish Royalists: transportation and indentured servitude in Barbados. Surrendering avoided both starvation and servitude. As well as the ordinary soldiers, the Royalist leadership which Middleton had left behind in the southern Highlands also came to terms. The Earl of Atholl was the first, signing a treaty of capitulation on the 24th of August. Less than a week later, the big man himself, the Earl of Glencairn, came to terms, signing on the 29th. Over the following weeks, Lord Forester, Viscount Kenmore, and the new Marquess of Montrose all surrendered to the government. Most of their subordinate officers followed suit. By the end of September, Middleton was still at large, but the vast majority of his supporters and soldiers had submitted. The terms of their surrenders were very lenient. Even people like Glencairn, specifically named as exceptions to the Act of Pardon and Grace, were spared the punishments listed in it. They had to lay down their arms, of course, and swear to maintain the peace, but they kept their estates and their lives. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist, though. Anything promised by Parliament from those estates, like reparations, was still going to be honoured, and they had to pay a deposit for their good behaviour, and this was often extortionately high. Glencairn himself was ordered to pay £5,000, which was a crazy amount of money, but I suppose it's still cheap, considering his name was on the rebellion. Dow points out that some of the former rebels actually came out of this looking pretty good, compared to some other Royalists who had kept out of the fight, but had still suffered under the Act of Pardon and Grace. Another of Lilburn's recommendations was taken up here. Anyone who wanted to raise troops for service overseas could do so. Monck had supported this policy under Lilburn, and he made it happen now in these treaties. Monck did not let up. He welcomed the arrival of more money from London and greeted it with a demand for even more money. He wrote regularly to the Lord Protector, insisting that though the back of the rebellion had been broken, it wasn't yet defeated. Unrest and instability could easily revive it, unless there was a strong military presence, which cost a fortune. And at least partly because his troops had burnt half the Highlands to the ground, the cess could barely gather £6,000 a month, and Monck flatly refused to try for the full 10,000. More money, though never enough money, did flow north. Middleton, for his part, still refused to surrender. Monck seems genuinely irritated by this stubbornness. This irritation translated into harsher tactics. In October, he amended his orders to allow the immediate execution of anyone who had surrendered but then broken their parole. Summary execution was also to be handed down to anyone caught burning property of those loyal to the government. Monck's strategy of rigour and ruin meant a difficult winter for the Royalists and the people sheltering them. More than once, Middleton himself was driven off by Highlander communities when he tried to requisition, or as they saw it, steal, their cattle. Whatever sympathy they might have had for the Royalist cause, starvation was still starvation. Middleton's attempts to recruit more soldiers were similarly unsuccessful. He summoned clan chiefs and nobles that were personally loyal to him, and set a date for a rendezvous in November. We aren't even sure if the meeting happened, it was such a flop. If a few people did turn up, it wasn't enough to leave any evidence in the records. Other Royalist leaders had similar trouble. Men just weren't turning up to fight anymore. Middleton spent a miserable December prowling the northwest tip of Scotland, facing snowstorms for days on end, with, by some accounts, only 20 people with him. In his comfortable exile, Charles wrote to his general and urged him to keep up the fight. I'm genuinely surprised we have these letters. If I was Middleton, I'd have used them for kindling. When 1655 opened with more surrenders to the Commonwealth, many of the Highland nobles involved received similar terms as those given to Glencairn and co., with the notable exception that they were permitted to carry arms and raise armed men to protect themselves and their territory from brigands. Monck allowed this because now the former rebels would have to confront their former comrades, and it removed the need for expensive English troops to enforce law and order by making the Highlanders police themselves. As winter turned to spring, the surrenders kept coming. Monck helped speed things along with a few deals. Lord Lorne, Argyle's son, was told that if he helped capture one Colonel Macnaghten, he'd get better terms. Macnaghten was told that if he helped capture Cameron of Lochiel, then he'd get better terms. And if Cameron of Lochiel helped bring in Glengarry, well, you get the picture. But even so, no final agreements were made by these last holdouts until Middleton gave the word. The general had almost come to terms with Monck himself in January, but where Monck had been generous with his subordinates, he was harsh with the leader. 4/5 of Middleton's estates were to be forfeit, with the remaining fifth for his wife and children. Negotiations broke off at the last minute. The price was just too high for Middleton, and he took refuge on the Isle of Skye. When his host admitted defeat and surrendered to Monck's negotiators, Middleton accepted reality, and wrote to his last loyal supporters to tell them to make the best terms they could. After this, Lorne, Glengarry, Lochiel, and Macnaghten all surrendered to the Commonwealth. Middleton himself didn't submit. In April, he found a ship and sailed away from Scotland. He'd be back at the court in exile, and he had not given up his hopes to make Scotland a springboard for the Royalist restoration. When Glengarry, who had really started this whole thing, finally surrendered to Monck, Glencairn's rising was over. Scotland wasn't at peace. There were still bands of roving soldiers, bandits, robberies, only made worse by the scorched earth tactics of the armies, rebel and government. Monck's job was now to fix the country he'd just helped ravage, but organised resistance had been defeated, for now. The Commonwealth now had to govern Scotland, which was now, legally, a constituent part of itself. In August 1654, elections had been held for the 30 MPs Scotland had in the new constitution. Next time, we will see the first Protectorate Parliament, as Lord Protector Cromwell tries to get everyone on board. Thank you for listening to Pax Britannica, and thank you to my House of Lords, particularly the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Fernando Lopez Ojeda, the Duchess of Wellington, Sue Bremner, the Marquis of Clarence, Rory Martyn, and the Earl of Seattle, Paul Trefasu. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. I'll have some major news soon, so now's the time to sign up. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.